Ooh, someone left a chocolate here. Maybe that's for later. Get myself settled here. Okay. I'm going to introduce myself first, because you all don't know me at all. So my name is Nikkivon Riesen. I do work at Youth for Christ in Brandon. I'm here with my family. Got my husband, Steve, and my 3 kids are here with me today, and they're going to, well, we'll see if I can keep them interested. I'm just their mom. So this morning I was invited to share with you. Tim heard me speak a while back at my church and invited me to share with you guys as well this morning on reconciliation. And this feels like a big thing to show up as a guest and speak about, because I don't know your community. I don't know the struggles that you are carrying here today. I don't know what this church is carrying today. So if anything feels very close to home, I assure you I wasn't secretly invited to speak on anything. This is just what I've spoken on in the past, and I really feel passionately about because of the work that I've done and the work that I continue to do. So I work as a counselor. That's kind of my job with YFC. With U-Turn, I don't know if Rena has been here. I saw her newsletter out front. In U-Turn, I'm a counselor 3 days a week. There is my role there, and then I have a private practice outside of that. Before that, I worked in child welfare services for 10 years, both in Winnipeg and here when we moved here. So I grew up in Winnipeg. My husband grew up in Niverville, a town just south of Winnipeg, and we moved here about 7 years ago. And that's a separate story, how we came to be here and all the ways that God's been good to us in this move and in forming new community. But a bit of it was a returning home. My husband's dad grew up farming in Justice, so he's enjoyed some of the connections that we've been able to make of folks that he knows, that he grew up with out here. So today I'm talking about reconciliation, and this feels like a big thing. I'm going to talk about what it means for our context today and why it matters for those of us who are trying our best to follow in Jesus' footsteps. So as usual, when I'm invited to speak on a topic here or other places or at my own church, I'm speaking on something that I am not a master of, and so I am preaching to myself today too. I'm not up here telling you I'm amazing at this all the time. I am not. I am still very human. But hopefully we can learn about it a bit more together today. So in my work as a counselor, as you can imagine, I get to hear and see a lot of different stories. I get to hear about the events that have shaped people's behaviors, about the hurt that they carry, and also the hopes that they're scared to say out loud. Part of my job is helping people to see unhealthy patterns, areas where they keep falling into the same ways of reacting and the same ways of coping, ways that are no longer helping them to live the kind of life or be the kind of person that they really want to be. There's many unhelpful patterns of behavior that I see when I'm working with folks, unhelpful patterns of behavior that we all fall into. Many of our behaviors are helpful and make sense in the short term, but then they end up causing pain in the long term. There's one behavior in particularly that's really interesting to me that I see a lot. And it's especially common amongst the younger folks. I work with a lot of teenagers, a lot of young adults, especially at U-Turn. And it's this practice of really quickly cutting people out of their life, instantly. This could be by ghosting their friends, like not replying to their texts from that friend any longer, blocking them on all social media, the equivalent of screening all their phone calls or not replying to emails anymore, suddenly avoiding at the office, pretending not to see someone at the grocery store. We've probably all done that once or twice. Essentially, I see this pattern of pretending that someone no longer exists if there's been a disagreement. Now, to clarify, when I'm talking negatively about cutting people off today, I'm not talking about the separation that's needed when someone is trying to start over with a new, sober group of friends, or find a non-abusive partner and a safe new friend group, or the need to put up really safe boundaries if there's really manipulative family or friends who have consistently hurt us. I am talking about the practice of just disposing of friendships or coworkers or acquaintances anytime there's a disagreement or a difficult conversation or interaction. When we decide that anyone who makes us feel some way we don't like, Whether it's offended or angry or stupid or weak or exposed, the false belief that my only option is to simply stop talking to that person. To at best pretend they no longer exist to me, and at worst, to try and get others to cut them off as well, because we're on the same side. A really quick way for me to assess how well someone's mental health is when I first meet with them, how adjusted into adulthood, how equipped they are with really useful life skills that I can see carrying them into a rich and meaningful life, is to count how many people they've stopped talking to due to a perceived offense or slight without making any effort to work through it. So this morning, we're going to talk about reconciliation and how hard and awkward it is. What it means for you and me to be people who mend bridges that are broken rather than choosing a different route the rest of our life or just hoping the bridge fixes itself. How those of us who are trying to follow Jesus' way can move toward what needs healing rather than simply walking away from the relationships that have become strained or awkward or damaged. To at least attempt to make peace where there's animosity or indifference, both with other Jesus followers and in our greater community. I got a lot of scripture I'm going to be going through today. You are welcome to open your Bible if you have it. If you have a Bible app, you can follow along. I'll have it on the screen as well. So we're going to start in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 21. You've heard that our ancestors were told you must not murder. If you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. But I say, if you're even angry with someone, you're subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you're in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. So, if you're presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person. Then come and offer your sacrifice to God. That's a lot in that really short section of verses. Jesus is telling the people that were listening to him that day, if you're in the process of being a very good religious Jew, I want you to stop all your practices and go be reconciled. And then I'm happy to watch you be a very good religious person. Jesus really cared and cares about us living reconciled relationships, or at least attempting to. But being reconciled to one another is a skill that we do have to practice within our homes, in our churches, with our neighbors, our coworkers. Our kids and our colleagues and our friends need to see this modeled, because I see less and less capacity for people to sit with those they just kind of don't like or don't agree with. My kids need to see that I can be in relationship with, in working relationships with, in literal neighborhoods with people that we don't see eye to eye on everything about, but we're able to be with in a good way. Or we're going to become really fragmented more than we are, and more disconnected from each other. And we'll lose our ability to disagree well. We'll become like those who wonder why everyone else is so messed up, leaving a wake of people that we used to have relationships with, and the bitterness that comes with it. We eventually stop seeing our role in what's left twisted and broken behind us. Jer Swigert. So he's a man who's the founder of something called Global Immerse. And in his work, he explores the intersections of faith and leadership and peacemaking. And on a podcast I was listening to last summer called Where We Belong, he said, let's see if I can get it up here. Yeah. So Christians should be the world's leaders at reconciliation. We should be the best on the planet at bridging difference into relationship with others, irritants and enemies, recognizing that the one we claim to follow was the only one who took us beyond convenient understandings of neighbor love to enemy love. That one really hits me. We should be the best on the planet at bridging the difference into relationship. Swiggert's referring here, of course, to the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus shifts the crowd's understanding of the old command to love your neighbor as yourself. It's so much more than our literal neighbor, except even that is actually really hard sometimes. In the parable, he wanted to know, is it just the person nearest to me? But even the people nearest us, we just struggle with that too. To Jesus, loving a neighbor meant loving all, even enemies, and certainly everything in between there. People we're neutral toward, indifferent toward, would rather just not run into. Not only those we easily get along with, but those who are very different, even who may hold animosity toward us. Again, in Matthew 5, I'm going to verse 43 this time. You've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven, for he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you're kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. If we're not left convicted by passages like this, I'm not sure we're paying attention to how we actually live in the world. Unless you're all way better than me at just loving everybody, holding no grudges, moving toward every awkward relationship that you encounter. But I don't naturally react that way all the time. The ways we behave toward one another matter. And Jesus, he doesn't give us a lot of wiggle room in these passages, like, well, if they really annoyed you, or if, like, he's talking about all the way up to enemies. I hope you don't have a lot of true enemies in your life, but maybe you do. This is what Christ asks of us, and this is the way that we who are trying to follow Jesus are asked to live, and this is hard, really hard. As humans, we really want to belong, and we want to find people that we fit with, and we often organize ourselves into groups based on who we are and who we're not. And so we fall into wanting our friends to always agree with us, to disapprove of what we disapprove of, to disapprove of who we disapprove of. And we want distance between ourselves and our group and them, whoever they are. Maybe they're too rich, or they're too poor, or they're too loud in public, or they're too shy, or they're too proud, or their house is too messy, or it's too clean, actually, or their kids are really difficult, or their kids just seem too perfect, or they really suck up at work, or they don't try hard enough, or I'm sure we could all come up with our own list. In that previous quote, J.R. Swigert states that Christians should be the best on the planet at bridging difference. And yet, we're rarely known for this. My mom shared an interesting story with me recently about the power of mending rifts from our past. So she was telling me the story about two close family friends of ours, men I've known my whole life. Let's call them Frank and Bill. So our friend Frank had long ago taken his business away from Bill. He was upset about rumors that he had heard about how Bill was running his business, how he treated his staff. When this happened, Bill noticed. He noticed that Frank was no longer a client of his. And Bill reached out. He sent an email asking Frank, so what happened? I'd love to meet for coffee. I noticed that you're not here anymore. It matters to me. We've been friends. Frank was upset at Bill at the time, and so he didn't even reply to the email. And he didn't follow up in any way. Now, both of these men professed to follow Jesus. In fact, Frank's job was to work in resolving conflict in business. and with families. And yet he ignored Bill's attempt to meet up, to have the tough discussion. Years passed, many years passed since this kind of break in relationship. Now, Frank had recently taken ill quite seriously. And he was asking my mom, how are you still friends with Bill? How does your family spend time with that man? After what I've heard, what I thought I knew. And my mom explained that the growth we had seen in Bill, how he sought mentorship and guidance, how there was good there alongside the parts that are still hard to love, like most of us. After hearing my mom's side of things, Frank asked my mom to text Bill for him because he didn't know how to reach out in a good way after so many years had passed. To ask Bill for him, would he still meet up for that coffee all these years later? Frank knew what was in his heart, that it was a lot more than just deciding to take his business elsewhere. And he was convicted of the judgment that he still carried toward Bill in his role in cutting somebody off. So my mom sent this message. Immediately, like within minutes, she gets a message back from Bill. Tell Frank there are tears in my eyes as I read this message. Yes, I would love to meet for coffee, and I look forward to it. There's power in offering reconciliation, in reaching out, in trying to mend that which has been broken, even if we once felt justified in ending the relationship. Now, does having coffee together mean that Frank and Bill will see eye to eye on everything and now they're best friends? No. But both men will be able to say that they tried, and an awkward peacemaking is better than a permanently turned back any day. I've worked with both youth and adults who have separated themselves from everyone in their life that they've had a disagreement with, who challenged them, who offended them, who started having a different opinion than them. And while it's easier in the short term to avoid those we have difficulty with, in the long term it leaves us barely able to leave home without running into somebody that we have a bad history with. This behavior leads us to believe that we have it right and everyone else has it wrong, and we lose our capacity not just for major disagreements, but for even small inconveniences. We begin to avoid certain people and places until our social circle is made up of only those who look like us, talk like us, act like us, or worse, we force those around us to pretend that they agree with us because they know we'll cut them off or push them away if we're honest with them. Ephesians 4, verse 2 encourages us. Always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. We're not asked to pretend that no one has faults, but to find room for them. Find room for people who are just too much for us. To remember that to some people we're too much, and our faults are hard to ignore. I was talking to a friend a few years ago, and she shared a really powerful story of reconciling with an old friend. There'd been a break in the relationship, and she felt really quite convicted about it and reached out and shared this really beautiful story of this mending of this relationship. And as she was telling me this, I was a bit prideful. I was kind of like, oh, I don't think there's anyone in my life that I need to do that with. And then instantly a name came to mind. Someone I hadn't thought about in 15 to 20 years, who I hadn't seen in that long. But as soon as the name came to mind, I was instantly convicted, and I knew this was someone I had not treated well, or at least through my lack of relationship had communicated she was just too much for me, and I didn't really know how to do that well. So this name comes to mind, and we live here now, and she's somewhere in Winnipeg, and I don't know where that is, but I said, okay, Lord, if I run into this person again, I'll apologize or something. I'll make amends. I didn't know what that looked like. But it felt pretty easy to say that because who knows where she is or where she lives these days. A couple weeks later, we were in church in Winnipeg visiting my family. And we sit down and start worship time, and who walks past me at this church and sits down 2 rows in front of me? But we'll call her Amanda. And I was like, seriously, God? I was really hoping I could just promise to talk to her, not actually have to talk to her. And so she's sitting there. Now, she grew up Catholic. This was a evangelical church my family goes to. I don't know anything about her story. I haven't seen her in 15 years at this point. And so I'm starting to get squirmy, knowing, I'm going to have to do something. I told God I would do something, and now she's sitting right in front of me. And then, of course, to top it off, it's Communion Sunday, and I'm a good Mennonite brother and raised girl, and we like to preach. We don't come to the communion table if there's issues between others in the community. And so they start passing out communion, and I know that I know. It's one of those moments where if you don't do something, you know it's disobedience. And so thank goodness it was like a new fancy big church, so it was very dark. And so I crept up a couple of rows, and I tapped on her shoulder, and my family and my husband are like, what are you doing now? I maybe do stuff like this sometimes. So I tapped on Amanda's shoulder, and I just said, can we talk at the back? And she's looking at me like, what? So we go to the back. Communion's being passed out. And we stood at the back, and I just said, God told me a couple weeks ago that if I saw you again, I had to apologize to you. I didn't treat you well. I think I made you feel like you were too much, and it wasn't right, and I need to apologize to you. I said, you might think I'm crazy and not remember anything I'm talking about, but I needed to do this, and so you can do with it what you will. And she was kind of surprised, and okay, Nikki, whatever. We both went and sat down and took communion. Later that day, she found me kind of through friend connections and sent me a message. She said, Nikki, you don't know what that meant to me. I always felt like I was too much for everyone in high school, and I started drinking, and I became an alcoholic through most of my 20s. I've been sober now for 3 years. And God's had me on a journey of realizing I'm not too much for him. And so she thanked me for reminding her that it was me who had to apologize for the way I had treated her. It wasn't that she was broken or bad. Are me and Amanda best friends now? No. Are we at peace in each other's presence? Yeah. Paul wrote in Romans 12, bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people, and don't think you know it all. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. I'll say it again, reconciliation is not easy. I really hope you're not hearing me say that today. And not everyone that I'm at odds with is interested in living at peace with me. But we're only responsible for our own actions to do all that we can to live in peace with everyone. And it will require humility and vulnerability and action on our part. It requires humility because I need to be clear-eyed about any role that I may have played in a relationship breakdown or how I handled a disagreement. It's really easy to find ways to blame others for our poor behavior, to blame our coworker for being bad at their job. It's their fault I lashed out like that. Our neighbor for not caring. It's their fault that I spoke to them that way. But I'm not responsible for anyone else. I am responsible for my response to others. I'm responsible for my role in widening the gap between us or shrinking it. I I've said it and I will say it hopefully forever. I am not perfect and I do not always react well in conflict or move naturally toward those who I don't see eye to eye with. But it starts with approaching others with humility, being clear that I am not always easy to be around either. Living at peace with one another does not mean that we let others walk all over us or that we have to make sure everyone likes us. It means that I have to pay attention to where I have justified avoiding what needs facing, where I've openly torn down instead of building up. Jesus' followers are called to love our enemies and bless those who curse us, and occasionally I need to ask God to show me where I've justified an unloving response to another child of God. Because you know that everyone you cross paths with is a child of God, created in his image. To be humble enough to see clearly where I've reacted inappropriately, and it's not very fun, but it's so important. It also requires a vulnerability that we're not really comfortable with. In my previous story about Frank and Bill, Frank put himself out there by getting in touch with Bill after all these years, and Bill could have ignored the peace offering. After all, he tried to make things right all those years ago and was ignored. He could have pretended the meeting was unnecessary or decided that he was too hurt to even try meeting. Guess what? Not everyone wants to live at peace with you. There may be folks who want to hold on to their grudges, who are not ready to forgive you or are simply not interested in fixing the relationship. Like I said, many of us don't have these skills. That's fine, that's on them. You are responsible for you, and I am responsible for me. Even now, as I've been talking, if there's someone that you know you need to reach out to, ask God for the courage to do it in a good way, in a humble way, accepting the risk that they're not ready, or that they may want to recount all your sins while you brought it up. Reconciling is a vulnerable and humbling thing. And lastly, unfortunately, it takes action. It doesn't just happen. Old wounds, old garments, or old arguments, they lose some of their sting, but they're not healed without action on our part. We can live like people who ignore the bumps and the tears and the brokenness until it builds up. Or we can be people who try and mend and try and mend. Not as though it never happened, but as though it did happen and it needs attention. These things stay as barriers between us. They rob us of peace within ourselves and amongst each other. Finding common ground, to be clear, isn't about me convincing you about how right I was all along, and it's not about me justifying my poor behavior until you let me off the hook. It's looking for a place in the middle to meet, a place to offer each other grace, of coming together to look at and mend the broken bridge instead of just hoping it will rebuild itself. Go back to Ephesians 4. This is Paul writing this. Therefore, I, a prisoner for serving the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of your calling, for you have been called by God. Always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. As I was talking, I was just thinking about this. My husband works in corrections. He's at the jail. And something that he's noticed over the years is depending on who's on shift, there's more encounters, arguments, incidents for some folks than there are for other staff, consistently. We have a choice about how we walk in the world. Are we people who escalate brokenness, who escalate the argument to the next level, who increase the name calling, who antagonize, Or are we people who are peacemaking, bringing it down to the level where we can have good discussions? I spoke mostly today about interpersonal reconciliation, one-on-one, and this applies in our families, old friends, past coworkers. I'm not sure who you need to make amends with, if anyone. But this also applies to our systems and our churches. We as Christians consistently pick sides. We're good at it. We pick theologies we agree with and those we don't. It's why there's so many denominations and expressions of faith. It's way easier to part ways than to stick it out. It just is. It's easier to ignore the past than to begin hard and committed work of healing. I don't have to convince you that living at peace with one another is difficult. But I know that many of you have stories of the grace that it is to be offered an olive branch, of how much better it feels to reconcile than to harbor bitterness. So I'll leave you with one last story, and we'll wrap up for today. So I'm the oldest of 3 kids in my family. My sister's the youngest, and she's 3 years younger than me. And we did not get along growing up. This is not a unique story. Siblings don't always get along. But we really didn't get along. We're very different. For every rule I wanted to follow as a good oldest, she wanted to break. And for every room I wanted to quietly enter, she wanted to loudly run into it. And for every youth group night I attended, she had a party that she was lying to my parents about going to. She wanted to make her own mistakes and didn't want to apologize for it, and I wanted to avoid making any mistakes if at all possible. A bit of a chance for friction there. So by the time we were 18 and 15, we could barely speak a word to each other at all. It was really bad. We could barely enter the same room together without defenses are up and we're going to fight. Whether it's about the way you put the milk back in the fridge or what you're wearing, it was, neither of our best moments. She would accuse me of being judgmental and trying to be her mom, and I thought she was careless and hurting our parents and herself with her choices. But for some reason, at that age, as I was leaving home, I went to New Zealand for about 6 months after high school. I knew that it was my responsibility to fix this. I was the oldest. I noticed what was broken, and I knew it wasn't okay. I wrote her a poem right before I left about how much I loved and cared for her. Very unusual for us. I reached out more often to check on her while I was away, and once I was home, I worked really hard to diffuse arguments that started. I worked hard to apologize whenever I was again sucked into some stupid fight. And at first, she didn't trust my actions. She was on guard and ready to fight, ready to defend herself when I would come to make amends. And I had to bite my tongue when she made choices I didn't understand and realize there was more than one way to live. And I didn't have it all together either. Slowly, over months and years, we learned how to be together peacefully, to look for the strengths in one another instead of the differences. We got to choose to believe the best about each other and learn to find a middle ground. When my sister got married, she asked me to be her maid of honor. And during the speech, I told the crowd, while my role in this wedding may seem natural, I'm the only sister, of course I'm the maid of honor, this was actually the result of years of hard work, of moving toward instead of away, of trying to piece back together what we knew was broken. And I can assure you that having a relationship with my sister today was worth all the effort it took. And the effort it continues to take. We are still as different as we ever were. We have different worldviews on many things. The things we align on is a short list. But we live at peace with one another. And that is the most valuable thing to me. Our efforts won't always be welcomed by others, but I know that not trying leaves us with bitterness and regret. So I don't know if there's anyone that you've ever turned your back on. Maybe your natural inclination is kinder than mine. I don't know if anyone needs your forgiveness. I don't know if there's anyone that you have to apologize to. But I know that if we say we love Jesus, Scripture is clear that our posture should be that of moving toward reconciliation, of being humble and vulnerable and active participants in making broken things whole. It's not easy work, but it's such worthy work, you guys, in an increasingly divided world. I'm just going to finish with Micah 6:8. This is what he requires of you. Do what's right, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Thanks for giving me time to share with you today. This can feel like a heavy and a big one, but I trust that Jesus lets us carry things lightly as we walk from this place and know what our steps are in this week as we go to be the actual church in our communities and in our neighborhoods. If you're interested in hearing about my work and the counseling work I do at U-Turn, that's just my email. You can always ask to be added to my newsletter. I'm happy to send it to anyone that wants to hear about the work that we're doing and hear about the youth that we work with and the ways that we're trying to be working on reconciliation in our community and encouraging our youth to be people who work towards mending things that are broken, because it's so powerful. Thanks. That's all I have for today. I think it's potluck time. I don't know if are you going to come up to close down? Okay.